So I'd like to take just a couple of seconds just to thank our Birmingham Tech Week for their sponsors and for all the support they've done to get this event going. And also to all the people and all the organisations who contributed to the running of a very successful and engaging week. So thank you very much to all of those. So now, without further ado, I'll introduce you to our chair for tonight's discussion, Professor Karen Young. So Professor Young is Interdisciplinary Professorial Fellow in Law, Ethics and Informatics, based across both the Birmingham Law School and the School of Computer Science here at the University of Birmingham. She's actively involved in several technology policy and related initiatives in the UK and worldwide, including those concerned with governance of AI, which is one of her key research interests. So Karen, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ben, and welcome everyone. Thank you very much for tuning in, and I'm really excited to be hosting what I am sure will be a really interesting, rich and challenging discussion under the title of Mutant Algorithms and the Challenges of Responsible Data Science in Society. So when we were thinking of putting this panel together, we thought, how can we best convey the kinds of challenges that we want to talk about in this discussion? And of course, somebody threw in the mutant algorithm claim following the A-level fiasco earlier this summer, which I'm sure many of you will be much more familiar with than you would have liked to have been. And it's a good foil really for introducing the basic focus and topics for discussion this evening. So in many ways, the A-level fiasco was really the tip of the iceberg insofar as we see the influence of algorithms and data-driven decision-making infiltrating almost every area of contemporary life. So even more sophisticated algorithms than the one that was involved in the A-level exam results, including those that utilise machine learning, often referred to as artificial intelligence, are transforming almost every social sector, from transport, manufacturing and finance through to entertainment, education, health, shopping, mating and dating, with potentially dramatic implications for the way in which our economic, political and cultural power and our society in general carries out its affairs and its business. So although I'm sure we're all very familiar with the myriad benefits that these technologies offer, particularly in the form of efficiency and convenience, there are, as I'm sure you will know, lots of public anxiety about the rise of the machines. And the A-level fiasco illustrated this in many ways, and we see growing recognition of the need for and importance of exercising meaningful oversight and supervision over these powerful technologies, and the need to work towards a more responsible, inclusive approach to their design, development and implementation. So that's the focus and foil for our discussion today. We have four wonderful experts and panelists who have very kindly agreed to join us for this discussion. And the way it's going to proceed is I will introduce all of our speakers one at a time, and they will speak for about 5 to 6 minutes each. And at the end of the four speakers, I'm going to invite you to ask questions, and we'll open up for a more general discussion. So on that note, I'd like to introduce our first speaker. That's Marion Oswald. And Marion is the Vice-Chancellor Senior Fellow in Law and also, at Northumbria University in Newcastle. And she's also connected with Birmingham in that she is Chair of the West Midlands Police and Crime Commissioner and West Midlands Police Data Ethics Committee. So I know Marion's work very well because we have lots of overlapping research interests, and Marion researches the interaction between law and digital technology, and she has a particular interest in the use of information and innovative technology by criminal justice bodies and the wider public sector. She is a solicitor, non-practicing, with previous experience in legal management roles within private practice, international firms and the central British government, including in national security. She's worked extensively in the fields of data protection, freedom of information and information technology, and has advised on a number of information technology implications, data sharing projects and statutory reforms. So with that introduction, I'd like to hand over to Marion. Thanks very much, Marion.
Thanks, Karen. That's great. Thank you very much for that introduction. I'm really pleased to be here. When I saw the title, what first struck me was remembering Boris Johnson speaking on a visit to a secondary school and remarking that I'm afraid your grades were almost derailed by a mutant algorithm. So perhaps leaving us with an image of an out of control artificial intelligence rampaging through spreadsheets of A-level results and changing them at random. But of course, this actually was not what happened. And categorizing the algorithm as mutants, I think, tended to distract attention away from the rather more prosaic responsibilities of humans to get the statistics and the technology right. So if we think back to what actually happened, in the absence of exams due to the COVID pandemic, Ofqual's statistical model was designed to allocate a fair grade to individuals in the absence of actual exams. But unfortunately, the model failed to use teacher grade predictions for the majority of students. And that was something that people thought very relevant to the assessment of individual students. And on the other hand, the model used cohort performance from previous years and ranked students against that. And that was something that people found to be unfair, hence all the protests that we saw against the algorithm and the placards with slogans such as "I am not my postcode, rank me, not my postcode." So was that something that was avoidable? And I think, yes, it was an avoidable outcome. And I'm a strong believer that going back to some of the basics of very old legal principles can really help us to avoid similar or potentially even worse outcomes when using algorithms. So these legal principles are designed to ensure that decision making by public bodies such as Ofqual and others is fair. And these principles apply equally to when decision making by public bodies use an algorithm to help them. So for instance, public bodies have legal functions. Sometimes these are set out in legislation, in statute, or sometimes they're set out in the common law. And Ofqual, for example, is responsible for ensuring that qualifications give a reliable indication of achievement and knowledge, the students' achievement and knowledge. And I think we can ask the question, was the algorithm doing this when some students who were predicted A's and B's were getting very low grades or even fails? And I suspect the answer to that question is no. And public bodies also have to take into account relevant factors in their decision making and have a duty not to take into account irrelevant ones. And I think often with data science, there's a temptation to throw as much data as you have into a model and see what comes out at the other end. But and that might be appropriate in some circumstances where you're trying to investigate and perhaps do research, but where you're considering very important outcomes for individuals, you have really to think about whether the factors, the data that you're using are relevant to the question that you've got to answer. Why, for example, is performance of a group of students in the previous year relevant to my particular A-level grade now? If we think about policing as well, is the number of times, for example, I've been stopped and searched on the street relevant to a determination about me, about perhaps my likelihood to go on and offend, or is it a factor that I can't in fact control? So independent oversight, Karen mentioned that the committee that I chair, independent oversight, I think, can help public bodies think through all these quite challenging questions in respect of the use of algorithms. I chair the West Midlands PCC and West Midlands Police Data Ethics Committee, rather a mouthful there, but it is the first of its kind within policing in England and Wales to specifically be set up to consider the use of data analytics and algorithms in policing. And it's thanks to the commitment of the PCC and the Chief Constable that this committee is really leading the way nationally in demonstrating how the input of an independent body with a wide range of expertise and experience can help shape data analytics tools within policing and take into account some of these wider concerns. And we're hopeful that this will pave the way for a national model going forward. And just finally, probably the key question that the committee always asks about any data-driven tool is, how is the tool going to be used in the real world? And what might the consequences be for individuals? And I think this is the question that we should always ask when we're thinking about algorithms. Thanks, Karen.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Marion. Really helpful to have your insight from, as an administrative lawyer in particular, because it's not a perspective that's often brought to bear, I think, when these discussions about data and algorithms come up. But as you know, I think it's an incredibly important one and actually incredibly helpful in thinking about how we go about the process of making sure we don't have these kinds of fiascos when algorithms and data-driven decision-making merges into the real world. So I just would like to hand over to a different kind of lawyer, and it's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Anand Pandya from Accenture. And Anand is a legal counsel for its technology and innovation group. He's also a lawyer, but he describes himself as a technology lawyer. And I'm still not quite sure what a technology lawyer is, although people say that's what I am, but I'm not quite sure about that. He's a technology lawyer responsible for advising on complex IT agreements. He is currently driving the development and implementation of legal tech for Accenture, having been closely involved in the development of Accenture's award-winning AI-driven contract analytics tool, Alice. Anand has over a decade of experience in IT consulting, software development, and digital media, having founded multiple technology businesses after beginning his career in private legal practice. He is also the co-founder of IP Harbour, a legal news website aimed at helping aspiring and junior lawyers break into technology and media industries. So on that note, I'm delighted to hand over to you, Anand.
Thank you very much, Karen. And I'm very pleased to be here. And I want to start by saying I completely agree with you, Marion. I think blaming the algorithm is a real red herring. And whilst all the protests we saw in mid-August outside the Department of Education, where students were chanting "F the algorithm," are helpful at drawing attention to automated decision-making, ultimately the algorithm in question performed how it was designed. And this was because of the product of human-led decisions. And I think actually the idea of human responsibility extends through all the layers of how these algorithms are implemented and used. And I'm using the word layers loosely here to describe the people, the process, the technology, the data. And that's what I really want to focus on, the human decisions at the heart of it. Because when designing algorithms for automated decision-making, we all know that they need to be free from bias. I mean, that's obvious, but how practical is that in the real world? I mean, when humans are actually designing these algorithms, I mean, the design outcomes of any system are grounded in the values and the goals of the designers. So along with the governance and the oversight, there might be some very good reasons why there is an intentional bias in the algorithm or why it's trying to drive a desired outcome. An illustration of this that I've read recently is around algorithms that are used in the US around school enrollment. So for example, in New York City, the algorithm that does the enrollment promotes social mobility, giving students who perform poorly in some elementary school tests priority admission into better performing middle schools. But then you contrast that to Washington, DC, where instead it favors students with siblings at a school who are then granted priority to those schools. The algorithms meet the desired outcomes of the creators. The designers influenced how the algorithms are. And as Marion discussed, legal principles along with independent oversight can contribute to the responsible use and design of algorithms. However, I think that we need to look at all of the human interactions in the whole stack and all the layers in which these algorithms are built and they're used and implemented. Starting sort of at the very bottom, the developers that are actually building these algorithms need to be really close to the decision making. As is the case across a lot of the technology industry, the coding is actually carried out far away from the decision makers in a silo. And actually, in order to drive responsible algorithms, the developers need to be educated on ethics, codes of conduct, the governance, and they need to be able to actually question what they're doing and have channels to raise concerns. And a combination of these things will help to promote algorithms that are designed and implemented in a responsible way. But even if the algorithm is correct, there will still possibly be bias and unintended consequences. There was a recent interview that I read in Fortune magazine. It was a scientist from MIT, and he asked the reader to imagine a scenario where a self-driving car failed to recognize people of a certain ethnic background as people, and it was therefore more likely to hit them. Quite a scary thought. And the argument here was this is because computers that were trained, the computers that run the algorithm rather, were trained on photo sets that didn't have or were underrepresenting certain groups of people. And this bias was in the facial recognition software. And there's been a lot of research to show that this sort of thing happens. So really, it was the underlying data that caused the problem, not the algorithm. And this, again, is nothing new. We know that the data that comes into an algorithm is really, really important. But again, it's human decisions around the data that have a huge impact. So when building an algorithm, the designers and the people implementing it need to think about what data to include and exclude. Is the data complete? Is there enough data? What overt or covert biases exist in the data? And does the data actually reflect the target group that the algorithm is aimed at? Does it reflect society and its values today, or is it outdated? An algorithm may produce undesirable outcomes because of historical data or stereotypes that exist in society. So even if you have a view into this black box, you might get a better idea of what an algorithm is doing. But if the underlying data is biased, the outcomes will be undesirable. And then the final sort of layer in human responsibility is actually, in my view, the one that's most important, but actually very much overlooked. And that's the responsibility that lies with the end user or the subject of that algorithm. And by that, I mean you and me, the public at large. In the world that we live in today, we're very often engaging with automated decision-making algorithms. We do it very willingly when we shop online or we ask Alexa to do something. Or sometimes we engage without really knowing. For example, we might submit a complaint online or request a public service and we don't actually know it's happening. And no doubt we need to scrutinize the data and methodologies behind these systems. We need explainable algorithms. We need accountability and oversight. And we need to be critical of the data. But our efforts shouldn't end there. We need to build, I believe, a really pervasive critical mindset to continually challenge algorithms across society. And this was particularly brought home by a story in the book, Automating Inequality, where the author describes her personal experience of being rejected for medical insurance in the US, and how, because she worked in this industry, she knew immediately that something might not be right, that automated decision-making was in play, and that she had been red flagged by an algorithm incorrectly. And knowing this equipped her with the tools to actually challenge what had happened. So I think what we need to do is actually level the playing field. I think the question that we need to be asking moving forwards is, how do we equip society at large to criticize and engage with automated decision making? Because I think there can't be algorithmic accountability or transparency without this critical audience. It needs to be a cross-section of society that's engaged with how these algorithms are designed and implemented, but also actually during its life, because society evolves, its values evolve. So we need to continue to evolve with it and challenge it. And there's been many, many examples of algorithms producing undesired results in recent years, but I don't think any have been sort of as widespread in their impact and as public as the A-level fiasco. And my hope is that the students shouting F the algorithm is actually just the start of a wider public interest. And that's sort of what I believe has led, obviously, to this panel, which is very, very interesting. But I really think that this sort of engagement and promoting this mindset will help us to have more responsible algorithms in the future. Thank you, Karen.
Thanks very much, Anand. I'm with you on the challenge of equipping society with the kinds of critical skills to push back, but how we achieve that is a pretty big question, but I'm sure we can come to that in the discussion, and then I'll ask you to answer it. But for the time being, I will hand over to a colleague who I'm really delighted to introduce, Sophia Adams-Batty, who I had the pleasure of meeting, I think it was about 18 months ago, when she was the Director of Policy and Regulation at the Law Society in England and Wales. She has moved on from there, but she brings with her to Wavelength, where she's Head of Strategy and Policy, enormous public policy expertise, having spent the past 20 years or so in the catacombs of policy development and regulation. She's held senior roles with various regulators, including the General Medical Council, the Competition and Markets Authority, the Financial Conduct Authority, as well as the Law Society, where she spearheaded the Commission on AI and Criminal Justice. She's now the Head of Strategy and Policy at Simmons Wavelength, a legal engineering company, where she's leading the exploration of the intersection of policy, law and technology, looking for real-world policy problems, well, that's not hard to find, and finding ways in which technology and data science can help to solve them. And most importantly, she is an alum of the University of Birmingham. So on that note, over to you, Sophia.
Karen, thank you, and good evening, everybody. And what a pleasure to be here but not be there, which is the really sad bit of it. As Karen said, I am an alum of Birmingham. I also grew up in Stoke, so I'm a true Midlander, and I had dearly hoped that we could have been there in person, but we're not. But it's great to be part of this panel, so thank you for inviting me to participate in a conversation that I'm really glad has come back to the fore, because on many of the policy problems, and you're right, Karen, I've chosen a pretty easy focus of area of work, haven't I? Choosing policy problems, there's lots of them. That there are many things that should be at the fore of our minds, which the current crisis has necessarily overshadowed a little bit. And I do feel that actually sometimes after a crisis, you get a moment to reflect and rethink and reorientate. And let's hope that this might be one of those moments. So mutant algorithms. First of all, both Karen and Marion and Anand, your comments, I couldn't agree with them more. So let me try and add rather than try to duplicate. In my own view, at least, when we look at the role of the implications of algorithms and data science in society, there are clearly positives, cancer diagnoses and so on. There's also really clear potential harms and real world harms. We've seen that in the work that Marion and others have done, looking at the impact of crime reporting and so on, or biases in recruitment, for instance, is an often cited example, isn't it? But it serves as well, I think, to actually take a step back and really consider purpose. And because ultimately, data science, data, AI, they have no purpose of their own. Data isn't ethical or unethical. It's not intrinsically good or intrinsically evil. It's what we do with it that matters. It's what we choose to do and what we choose not to do. And I think inaction is as powerful as action. Just because you can doesn't mean to say you should. And, just because I can shout really loudly at my children when they're misbehaving doesn't mean to say that's a great parenting technique. Invariably leads to complete failure on my part and an escalation of the war. And I think it really matters to consider it in that way, because it's all about where responsibility lies and where we have empowerment to act. And that, I think, fundamentally is part of this. Because my worry, at least, and for those who've heard me speak on this before, apologies, I sound probably a bit like a broken record, is that we're sleepily, unawares, just inactively engaging with this world, or not even engaging, just living the life of a citizen in a society where we are deploying AI, almost in a kind of laissez-faire, that's not for me to engage with, that's a little bit too difficult for me to want to consider. And that's us as citizens, it's us as business leaders, it's us as maybe members of decision-making fora. And I think that is possibly one of the most dangerous elements of this. It's not the data that scares me. It's the inactivity or the lack of willingness, the deference to. And you could replace that with anything. In the past, it might have been deference to the power of industry. And at the moment, it's a deference to the power of what we see coming through the might of the vast amounts of data and the computational capabilities we have today that we didn't have before. That's why it's different. That's why it's not 10 years ago that we're having this debate. It's why we're having it now. And I think in that sense, this idea that is rather pervasive, I see it all the time in common parlance. What does the data tell us? Can we get some AI to do that for us? Almost as if it's the silver bullet, the omniscient power, the all-being, all-powerful, godlike creature that will solve all of our problems. And brilliantly, we can all sit back and lie on our sun lounges and not worry about the tensions in policy. Because fundamentally, there are always going to be policy tensions between a good that you can achieve and a harm it might elicit, either knowingly or unintended. And the whole art of policy making is to balance those tensions, and to balance those tensions in keeping with societal values. Because if it wasn't difficult, we wouldn't have entire tranches of Whitehall trying to work out what the policy problem would be to poverty or inequality or health outcomes and so on. And I think in this sense, it really helps to think about the relationship between data and policy making, or data and the problem that we're trying to solve. Rather than putting it in the master position of the relationship, make it the servant. Start with the policy problem and then consider what the implications might be. Should we get that right or should we get that wrong? What are the tensions that underpin it? And then make the data and the data science capabilities respond to those needs, but always in the subservient relationship, because then we feel empowered to question it. There's tons of research that's shown that actually when presented with an answer that has been generated by some computational capability, that people will naturally defer to it because they think, oh, I don't know how it works, it's probably right. But actually rebalancing that narrative to one of, this is a tool that is subservient to your judgment, not only is for the better good, but also is the mechanism that might trigger us to wake up from the sleepy little dream that we've had, that data will save us all. I think in that lies the kind of solutions that would have helped avoid the problems that we saw over the summer with the Ofqual debacle, because it wasn't necessarily the answers that the system deployed, and I say system in multiple ways. It wasn't just an AI algorithm that was running, but the way in which that was deployed in decision making, so systems in its fullest sense. It wasn't that they were giving the wrong answers, it's because they lacked legitimacy, in my view, at least. What people were railing against was the sense that you could be judged, your future could be determined by the past history of people unrelated to you. And that was essentially enshrining inequalities again, entrenching those inequalities that we've seen before. And there was no license to do that. There was no democratic license. There was no open acceptance of the fact that that was a necessary evil, so to speak, of trying to come to some solution to the problem that we find ourselves in because of COVID. And it's that lack of democratic legitimacy. So how do we deal with it? So I think there's a 3-point plan. The first of these I've already mentioned. Start with and remain centrally focused on the policy problem and make data the servant of solving that, but with a clear clarity of purpose and with a sense of what legitimacy would look like in the eyes of society, on whose behalf we either undertake our private actions and our public actions. So private business has as much of a role in this. This isn't just about public bodies displacing their responsibilities on mutant algorithms, as they might describe it. I say also beware of false objectivity. This is a significant problem in my view, at least, which is people don't really understand the data science and therefore just assume, because it has science in the word, in the name, that it's reliable. We'll just it's objective. Of course it's objective. No, it's not. It's not objective, because the data going in won't be always clean, so you can't rely on that. And finally, we talk about responsible use of data. Actually, I'd like to reframe it. I would say responsible decision making, responsible business ethics, responsible governance. And I think if we get those right, we might just be able to come out of this particular COVID induced episode with a slightly clearer, firmer view of how we ensure that we use AI and data capabilities with core purpose to better society.
Thank you, Sophia. Couldn't agree more with your framing of the problem. The challenge, though, is, as Anand put it, is getting to the solution so that everybody is able to bring that critical faculty to bear on incredibly sophisticated tools. So I'm going to ask that question a little bit later, but we'll come to that. Thank you very much, Sophia. I'm now going to introduce John Groom, but before I do, just can I ask all our participants, after John's spoken, I'm going to open up to Q&A, and can I just invite you, if you're starting to think about questions, do feel free to enter them in the Q&A box, and then I will make sure that our speakers have an opportunity to address those after John has spoken. So it's my pleasure to introduce our final speaker. John is a media and technology lawyer and senior associate in Baker & McKenzie's IP tech team. His practice encompasses a broad range of both contentious and non-contentious aspects of IP, technology and commercial law, with a particular focus on copyright, digital media and new technologies. John writes regularly on these topics, and earlier in the year he was elected to Tech UK's Data Analytics and AI Leadership Committee. John is based in London, having spent 2018 in Baker & McKenzie's San Francisco office. I bet that was fun. And John is also heavily involved in the firm's tech-focused pro bono work, as well as its social mobility initiative. So on that note, John, please, you can have the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Karen. It's a pleasure. So thank you for having me. I just going to pick up on something that Sophia just mentioned. Couldn't agree more that this is absolutely essential for private companies to grapple with, not just public bodies. And I can definitely speak to that in my slot now. But I think a theme that flows through everything that's been said so far is around how essential trust is for the potential of AI to be realized in the right way. And I think each of the points raised so far has a very relevant angle in that whole discussion around how we ensure trust in AI, whether it's around general buy-in from the public or just generally protecting against the killer robots that are coming for us. But for me, I think there are a few really key philosophical themes, philosophical elements that are essential if we're going to leverage AI in the right way. The need for human oversight is one of those, and Anand in particular spoke about how important human oversight is. But I think there are three other fundamental themes that I'd like to speak to and focus our minds on if we're going to avoid these mutant algorithms. And those for me are fairness, accountability, and transparency. So on fairness, AI has to be fair. We know it has to be fair, but what does it actually mean? Ultimately, ensuring algorithms are free from bias, absolutely. Anand talked to that really, really strongly. But a couple of further layers to that question around fairness. And I think that one question I want to pick up on is around fairness. Is the not just the algorithm biased, but is the data itself biased? For example, a lot of training of machines and models is done on out of copyright works. So old books, studies, documents. I mean, think about when that was, sort of 150 years ago, earlier even. Those works reflected a society which is very different to ours in many ways. Even the best AI will struggle to pick up the sort of subtle critique of the patriarchy in Jane Austen novels. But I think the key point here is that the model might have been trained on data relevant to a society that isn't today's reality, or at least when it's rolled out, it actually just entrenches some existing biases that still exist today. There is a wider point as well there as well. So it's not just on the algorithm or the data itself. Those two things have to be looked at. Those are elements for the product build phase that I often look at with clients. But fairness needs to be built into the testing, experimentation, and rollout phases as well. I think not enough emphasis is put on that kind of rollout phase. Even after something's been released or during testing, we need to know how an algorithm interacts with humans when it's rolled out. What are the consequences on people? Now, sometimes the answer might be that the algorithm is of great benefit to society, whether it's your coffee machine knowing that you need a coffee before you do, But sometimes the reality is that AI, may cause humans harm. The A-level algorithm is one example of where humans were harmed, and it was a result of an unfair, whether it's algorithm or underlying data, humans were harmed as a result of that, and not enough was done to protect humans. I do a lot of work with driverless car companies, and it's something they have to wrestle with all the time. And it's why driverless cars are some way off from general rollout, right? So fairness is this concept that needs to exist throughout the life of AI, not just in the build phase. The second issue that I want to talk about is around accountability. So in other words, who's responsible for an AI outcome? And we need to get to a place where AI and its results are owned. Without accountability, AI generates problems or harm, and there aren't checkpoints along the way to control it or to find someone responsible, or at least an explanation for each wrong turn. So what we need is companies to take ownership of algorithms, even mistakes. And the danger is that algorithms effectively just become an extension of bureaucracy. Marion pointed to Boris Johnson's quote, which pretty much epitomizes that sentiment. But this is a theme that I bring up often with tech companies that I work with. When you try to work out why something has gone wrong, you might hit dead ends or get unclear answers. It's not good enough to just kind of get lost in the bureau. It's not good enough to say you don't know who or what process is responsible for problems that have occurred, or at least you don't know why something has happened. And having this base level of accountability is key to building trust long term. The second element of accountability also goes to whether the AI that's being built should actually be done at all. Are there use cases that just shouldn't be pursued? There are some use cases that shouldn't be pursued without full and fair impact assessments being done. Facial recognition is a good example. Facial recognition, secures our phones, and most people can probably get on board with that. But what about in public places? There's an example just last week of the problems that facial recognition has had with the California bar exam, whereby people of color couldn't actually get into the exam because the system didn't recognize them. And it's just horrific to see that. And so what you want is someone to be accountable for that process. And again, facial recognition, it's been banned around the world, or at least its use has been banned by certain organizations. I do a lot of work in relation to AI tools in the police and justice system, where facial recognition is often used. And let's be clear, we're not close to Minority Report. Hopefully Marion can protect us from that. But without the right level of accountability, it might go that way in future. And so whether there are limits on, ensuring that there are limits on the right technology itself that's being used, or the circumstances in which it's used, or ensuring that it's not used in, particular countries where there are significant human rights concerns. For example, that's another way in which private companies can step up and be accountable in order to help this wider question of trust. And in terms of mutant algorithms, that's one area you really don't want to be getting wrong in relation to people's freedoms, right? The final point I just want to talk about is around transparency. So we need to make sure that we are transparent about AI. So first of all, it doesn't help to overclaim or overhype what AI can do. Often I'll see something labeled as AI when really it's just data mining with a gold sticker. That's a problem. That's funny, but there's a problem because it makes it difficult for the public to appreciate what AI actually is, what it can do, as well as its accuracy. And that's just another barrier to gaining broader trust. The more important here with transparency, though, is explainability. So being able to explain the AI that's being used. And so in certain scenarios, and people have alluded to, the black box problem. So in certain scenarios, we might be okay with a black box algorithm, building a model that we purposefully don't know what might happen. Medical diagnostics tools, for example. And I've worked with companies that are leveraging machine learning on enormous health data sets with limited instruction to the training, just to see what the model might be able to pick out or predict, because there's a recognition that as humans, we have limited capacity in terms of first of all, resources, but second of all, we're just conditioned by our training and our past experiences. So in many cases, you know, AI might be able to see something and make connections we can't. That's a very specific use case, though. In other scenarios, there's very good reason as to why you wouldn't want a black box algorithm being used. You know, the black box may well be the reason why the AI has gone mutant on us, but then we can't explain why those results have occurred, and we just won't build trust if there's an assumption that AI is uncontrollable or unexplainable. So I'll finish there, but yes, from those are three of the more important philosophical issues, I think.
Thank you very much, John. I'd just like to add an observation that it's unusual for me to be on a panel full of lawyers who have expertise in data science and algorithms, and it's also very uncommon that this theme of responsibility and the importance of human accountability to be quite so central in the discussion. So I'm really quite enjoying this. But anyway, we have now have about 16 minutes for Q&A, and we've already got two excellent questions that have come in. So thank you for those. And can I please encourage our other participants to keep pushing the questions forward. And I'll begin with the first one in terms of timing. This question is from Tom King, and he asks, are there any examples of public decision-making using data science as decision support which meets the expectations of the panel, or are current systems in use only tolerated because they affect less advantaged groups than A-level students? So I found that a really difficult question, and I'm going to hand over to my panelists to see if you've got an answer for Tom. Sophia.
I wonder whether or not the reason why we're all troubled by this question, or troubled, but why this question is problematic, is there probably are certain applications that meet the standards that we would expect, but actually there's such a lack of transparency. I see someone mentioned the question of the National Register of Algorithms. I know in the report that I published on algorithms in the justice system, we questioned whether or not there should be some public register, certainly for where we're deploying these sorts of decision-making tools in the public sector, whether or not that should be the case. But I do think it underlines a particular question, which is how would we know?
Absolutely.
There's no impact assessment, there's no transparency or standardization around these sorts of things. I would say that, going back to my point about purpose, there are certain use cases where I think I see really brilliant endeavors that clearly meet a need. A really great one of those, for example, is the nutrition early warning system, which looks at kind of crop failures and then tries to help predict where you might get shortages of food globally, to identify those regionally, those who might be at greatest risk. And that feels to me to really hit the test of desperately needed. Huge amounts of harm could be avoided, and probably we're not dealing with deeply contentious value judgments either. I don't know how others feel, but I certainly don't feel that we have enough transparency of deployment, certainly in the public sector, to really to make a judgment.
I think I'd agree with that, and I think that's some of the projects that have come through the West Midlands Police Committee been interesting examples of a very clear need for something to be done in the particular area, but what still needs to be worked through is whether the data science solution is going to be effective in that, in achieving that objective. So certainly we've seen projects which have got great potential to, for example, highlight very, very serious cases of modern slavery, or potentially the data might be able to be used to enable the police to better investigate certain crimes. I think what the committee is always trying to do is to take a step-by-step approach and to monitor those projects as they develop, and then potentially as they get operationalized, to use the term, because at that point, that's the point where you can really see what happens and potentially what some of the consequences might be that you might not have anticipated actually at the time. So I think it's really important to have that that process of evaluation going right the way through and into an environment where there might be consequences. And so not just stopping at a pilot stage and saying, oh, it looks like it works, let's just carry on. And I think that's why we're so uncertain, because we're not necessarily sure of the consequences yet.
Thank you, Marion. Anna and John, I don't know whether you'd like to add some thoughts to that pretty challenging question.
Yeah, it's a tough question, and I was thinking about it, and I was thinking to myself, is it the case that we only hear about something if it goes wrong, or if there's something, there's a problem with it? And I don't think that's entirely true, but you're right, we don't have that much transparency into all these algorithms out there. There's loads that we just don't see and don't even know about. So I think it's that's what makes it such a hard question. But I would hope that where there are problematic algorithms, they sort of rise up to the surface. And one of the things we need to continue to do, and Marion was alluding to this, is that it's all about, we can set something up and set it off into production, but actually we need to continually monitor. I think that's the important bit.
Thanks, Anand. John, any thoughts?
Yeah, so I mean, I don't have too much experience dealing with public bodies. Often where it overlaps is in relation in the facial recognition space, and I think Marion's done a great job of explaining the need for incremental expansion of that sort of thing with full impact assessments. The only thing that occurs to me is I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing that we often hear negative stories about these problems, because I think it keeps people honest. From the private sphere, there's enormous pressure on tech companies generally in the media, and one element you don't want to add to that pressure is the a bad algorithm story that's caused harm, right? So as in as a society, it's not necessarily a negative thing, because I think it keeps people focused and honest.
Thanks, thank you. Okay, and then I'm going to move on to a question from Pauline McBride. She says, thank you to the panel for very interesting presentations. I agree that the A-level fiasco served to encourage public discourse about the use of algorithms. Sophia suggested that the use of algorithms in this way lacked democratic legitimacy. Do the rest of the panel agree that the problem was one of legitimacy, bearing in mind Ofqual's powers? Might Ofqual have been able to use algorithms to adjust results in a way that was fair? And if so, what might that have looked like? That's a good question. And does the panel agree with the suggestion that there should be a national register of algorithms? So thank you, Pauline. Excellent question. Again, I'm going to open up to my panelists. Everyone's not really sure. Should we start with the question of do you see democratic legitimacy as an important, or ultimately that was one of the real problems with the A-level debacle, or do you see it as a different kind of problem? That's an interesting question.
I think it's I've just got up on my screen a quote from Roger Taylor, the chair of Ofqual, who said at the time the fundamental mistake was to believe that this would ever be acceptable to the public. And he comments on how they were trying to meet the Secretary of State's intention of ensuring grades were awarded in a consistent way with previous years. So in a way, they were trying to achieve a policy aim that was never going to be acceptable, because it therefore meant that from a statistical point of view, you had to compare people to previous years. And so it seems to me that the fundamental issue with that algorithm was this requirement for people to be categorized ranked as per previous years, so you were not being judged on your merits effectively. So I think that there was that issue with it never being potentially acceptable to the students affected.
I mean, I guess from a policy perspective, as someone who spent a lot of time doing policy work, which is, it wasn't the algorithm that was flawed, it was the policy. If you'd thought about the policy implications, how would people feel being judged in this way? What might be the reaction of the stakeholders? what might be the unintended consequences and the entrenchment of further inequalities. All of these would have been, with good policy making. I don't know the details, I'm not behind the scene, and I know there's far more complexity to this story than we see in the headlines, but they ought to have been borne out. And only then do you then reach for your fancy tech data science capability once you know what it is that you're trying to do and what you should seek to avoid. And I think fundamentally here it was a policy failure with a layer of data science going wrong.
Absolutely. Anyone else?
I was going to touch on sort of the next part of the question, which was about, do we think that there was a way they could have been able to do it which was fair? And I think we sort of alluded to already. I don't think there necessarily was. They could have come up with the right policy decisions, but taking it to to me, it comes down to the data. I'm just not sure that we could have ever done this correctly with the amount of data that we have in this sector. We had to look at historical data because we just don't have the data. There was a huge reliance on asking the teachers to give their opinions, which are obviously, the best intent. They're subjective opinions of the students. And one conversation I was having recently is, how could we have done it? Well, we needed more data. What would that data have been? Well, then we get into this scary big brother school where every single piece of work and every single action the student is doing is being tracked 24/7. And only then we have this really big data pitch that might have been able to do this. So that's my view, at least. I just think it would have been impossible with the data and the world that we're in today to really make this fair.
I wonder, what really strikes me about this conversation is the fact that if we'd never reached for the data science, and we had just done what we did in the end, which was, what were the teachers suggesting? Would we have had the same backlash from? And I don't think we would have done. And I think it's a humbling moment. To my point about the silver bullet, it wasn't actually. It probably aggravated a very difficult and anxious time for many parents and their children.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, Sophia. And I think actually, in many ways, the algorithm, the A-level fiasco, was a wonderful example of a wicked problem. How do you actually understand the nature of the problem? And there clearly was a problem in the absence of an examination system which was accepted as the legitimate way in which one makes an assessment of individual merit that's fair across the board, even though we know that examinations are flawed processes. Then if in the absence of those exams taking place, what method could be used in a way that would be regarded as legitimate to award grades to students in this position? And that is a question for which there is no straight answer, for which a set of answers are possible, for which one might reasonably accept. And that, I think, speaks to your point about the democratic legitimacy, about the real importance of buy-in from the stakeholders affected to really understand the nature of the problem, to come up with a solution that achieved that kind of buy-in, and most importantly, that allowed meaningful appeal for any individual student who felt aggrieved by the particular decision that was awarded. But we see this, I think, time and time again. There is what I like to call a kind of enchantment. We're still under the enchantment of the data, that somehow we can wave the magic data wand and we have, again, one of my least favorite words, we'll have a solution to a difficult social problem. Let's just bring on the solutions. If only life was that simple. Life is messy and the data does not solve the messiness of life's problems. And I think the A-level fiasco was a wonderful example of that. I don't want to take up too much time though, because there's still more of Pauline's questions here. And John, I haven't given you a chance to speak. So perhaps you want to come in on the rest of the question that Pauline has put to us.
So I think the National Register of Algorithms is part of the question that really drew my attention. I think that's a hugely interesting idea, and you'll appreciate from my my part of the panel earlier, I love it from a transparency perspective. I love the idea. I can see potential issues arising around the danger that we the problem that we face often with AI is that you need to get the balance right between ensuring that there is trust, but also not acting as preventing innovation and development. So, would there be a reluctance to develop algorithms, and because you have to publish them, and they are then open to scrutiny, potentially. From a public body perspective, that there might be an expectation that that should be something that comes out down the road, but we know that a lot of public bodies use private companies to assist with this tech, right? So there's a potential barrier there as well. But one angle here that we haven't really talked about yet is around privacy. And in some respects, that there is an element to which people can get an idea as to how an algorithm has worked, and that's from a data subject access request. If we are talking about AI that's been used on in relation to personal information, so automated use of data, you can request the data that is used on you to train those machines. Now, that is not the end of the problem, because that's only going to tell you about what the machine has done to you, but that's not a kind of wider societal thing. But I will offer that up as one angle in which there is an element of transparency.
Thank you, John. I'm really sad to see that actually we're 2 minutes short of the time and we have to wind up. And I could actually talk a leg off a chair in relation to these. And actually, if we were in real life, we'd all mingle and have a bit of a chat and a drink, and that would be really fun. And I'm really sorry, everybody, that we can't actually do that tonight. But on that note, I just want to thank our wonderful speakers, because I'm going to wind up now. Thank you for the insight that you bring. Thank you for drawing our attention to the difficult nature of these problems, but their importance. A quick little pitch to say that it's these kinds of questions that has prompted the University of Birmingham to launch a new MSc in Responsible Data Science in partnership with Accenture, which will be getting started in September, and we're really excited about that. But thank you, everybody, for your time and attention, and special thanks to our speakers tonight, and have a good evening. Thank you very much.